Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Nigeria's ruling APC party remains defiant that a new opposition alliance won't threaten President Muhammadu Buhari's chances of re-election next year. The group challenge follows the creation of a breakaway faction within the APC that also sees the back of Buhari. And South Sudanese government troops are accused of committing horrific atrocities against civilians by the United Nations. Investigators say hundreds were killed and over 120 girls and women raped in opposition villages earlier this year. And dishes inspired by flavours and traditions from across Africa are on offer in Paris for a special gastronomic festival focused on food-forward African cuisine. We tuck in to the We Eat Africa event. But first, Nigeria's president is beset on all sides. More than 30 parties have come together to create a new opposition alliance determined to stop President Muhammadu Buhari from being re-elected to a second term next year. That comes after last week's creation of a breakaway faction within the ruling APC party, who've dismissed the 75-year-old's 3 years in power as being a disaster. In 2015, Buhari became the first opposition candidate to ever defeat a sitting president in the country's history. But he has struggled to completely defeat Boko Haram insurgents. Fatal clashes between cattle herders and farmers have escalated, and there's concerns that he may not be physically fit to run again. Well, we're joined now by Sam Olukoya, who has more on this. Sam, Buhari's camp seems confident that it won't matter that there's so much formalised opposition to his rule. Can he truly ride it out?
Well, I think it's getting increasingly difficult for President Muhammadu Buhari, given what has happened in the last 1 week. First, we saw a group in the ruling party slipping away. Now we've seen this opposition coming together to challenge him during the election. So it's a bit difficult, but I think it's a bit too early to see what is going to happen. I mean, it all depends on what happens between now and the early next year when the elections will vote. But I think in whichever way you look at it, it is definitely not good news for the president, given that he has lost a large chunk from his party, and also the fact that this opposition has come together to.
So bearing in mind the splinter group that opposed to Buhari breaking away from the ruling APC last week, now the opposition's also pulling together against him. Apart from the president's fate, does all this pose a threat to the fractured APC party itself, regardless of what candidate it fields next year?
Yeah, this is another setback for the opposition, because if you consider the fact that a large chunk has broken away from from the ruling APC, and this chunk is carrying a number of parliamentarians, and they've now formed an alliance with the opposition. What this means is that the ruling party effectively becomes a minority, because the number of senators, House of Representatives members teaming up with the opposition who are coming from the ruling party, I mean, to make the ruling party, they will lose quite a lot of people, and by that they will become a minority. The ruling party was quite concerned about this, and that was why they took a lot of steps to stop this group from leaving, and where the group said they have to leave. But what
Sam?
The ruling party is saying that these people are of no consequence.
Sam Olukoya. Sam, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thanks very much. Sam Olukoya there telling us more about more challenges to President Muhammadu Buhari's hopes for re-election in next year's polls. Now, thousands of people took to the streets of Pretoria on Tuesday for the 100 Men March. Demonstrators gathered to condemn violence against women and children. The The march was organised by the government in a bid to get more men involved in campaigns to raise awareness of the effects of gender violence and abuse in the country. It's estimated that at least 1 in 5 adult women has been physically assaulted, and police have long been accused of not taking domestic violence seriously enough in the country. The UN human rights agencies raised the alarm about the continued horrific abuses of civilians committed by government forces in South Sudan's civil war. Investigators say that at least 232 people have been killed and 120 women and girls raped since spring in attacks by soldiers in opposition-held villages. 3 commanders suspected of bearing the greatest responsibility for the violence in dozens of communities across Unity State have been identified. The UN's called on the government and the African Union to establish a court for South Sudan to deal with the numerous and disturbing cases of atrocities during its conflict.
Victims and witnesses describe how the SPLA and aligned forces would storm into villages in the early morning around dawn, surround the village and start shooting at fleeing civilians. The attackers would then steal cattle, loot entire households, and burn down houses and food stocks. Civilians were targeted, with the elderly, people with disabilities, and very young children killed in horrific acts of violence.
Now, dishes inspired by flavours and traditions from across Africa were on offer in Paris for a special gastronomic festival focused on food-forward African cuisine. Afrofusion was on the menu, and our Sadia Manjo and Celia Caracina were there. Forks are ready to tuck in for us.
Duck tagine with dried fruit, black rice with cassava leaf and smoked fish. The We Eat Africa festival was about blending culinary worlds. 200 people attended Paris's first event dedicated to Afrofusion food. 16 chefs embodying the diversity of the continent's cuisine whipped up new flavours, combining elements of classical African dishes with ingredients and techniques from other cultures.
I can start with plantain and work around it with a soufflé or a crème for a dessert. A few weeks ago, we did a plantain ice cream with my students. When we tasted the ice cream, we got the plantain flavour, but without any of the oil or the grease. For me, that's real fusion delight.
The festival brought together all kinds of foodies, but Afrofusion's departure from tradition is not to everyone's taste.
We brought 2 generations of chefs together so that they could finally talk about it, so that the young can understand why the older generation is attached to tradition, and in turn that the older chefs get to know more about the new generation, who didn't necessarily grow up in Africa.
I always say fusion leads to confusion if it's overdone. Now you have chefs that think they can do fusion and will add cassava with basil, a bit of soy sauce and some honey, but it loses all meaning. I think that rediscovering the same flavors is much more important than creating flavors for the sake of creating.
Chefs here are passionate about their craft. Festival goers also get a chance to see all the thought that goes into preparation and take part in conferences and workshops. Organisers also want to tackle concerns that some African dishes tend to be unhealthy.
We often hear that African food is spicy and greasy, that it's not very healthy. We're African and we love African cuisine. To see it cooked in a more gastronomical fashion and introduced to Parisians is really interesting.
The cuisines of 12 countries, including Benin, Morocco, Mozambique and Senegal, were the focus this year. Organisers are hoping to expand what's on offer for next year in their bid to take African fare mainstream.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.